old Sufi philosophy, which is very interesting. That's ancient Islamic, a branch of ancient Islamic thought. And it was interpreted by a French philosopher called Henri Corbin. And Corbin wrote books about this ancient Sufi thought in which they had concepts of various worlds that were superimposed on the physical world. I think 9 worlds, there might have been more. But he was particularly interested in one world in particular, which he said lay between the physical world of our physical senses and the intellectual world that we think, is inside our heads. And this world was called the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world. And Corbin said, in the ancient Sufi philosophy, this is where the stories lived. It's where the archetypes lived. It's where dreams come from. It's where synchronicities happen. And what's critical about this, absolutely critical, and absolutely critical to my own work, is these things have independent existence. We do not make them up. It's not about us. We don't create all this stuff. If we're very lucky, it happens to us. So there is this world, the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world, in which all of these things exist and may interact with us. You could argue, and I would, that it is this mundus imaginalis is kind of an anima mundi. It's like the world soul. It's like the emanations of all of the creatures, not just human either. It's not just human. It's not about us. It's animals. It's rocks. It's trees. All of the kind of like I don't know. I never know the word to use, energies or whatever. Of all of the creatures, all of the things on this planet exist there, all of the imaginations, and it's all one great, wonderful soup, which if we're lucky will happen to us in our dreams or in stories or whatever. And so to me, the imagination is something very, very real. It is about things in the world outside of us happening to us so that they can guide us, communicate with us, tell us something we really, really need to know. And it is a bridge also between us, the world we think is inside our head, and the physical world. So to me, the imagination is literally a bridge that connects us back to place, to the land, to the world that we have become so disconnected from. So that's why I think imagination works, because it's actually real. There is a world in which it lives, and that world is a bridge between us and the land. Does that make sense? That's a whole other workshop. Lecture, story,
yeah. Your story of the well maidens made it occur to me that this hashtag #MeToo movement of women coming out about rape is happening with all these climatic calamities, environmental calamities. And I was wondering if you've ever, if you think it's a coincidence or if you put thoughts on that.
I think it's quite clear that if you look at the history of Western philosophy, the downgrading of nature happened at the same time as the downgrading of women, and there is a whole thread there where over the centuries women were associated with, in Western philosophy, women were associated with a physical world, and men with in their idea, superior world of the intellect and rationality. And so as men, rationality, the intellect was superior to physical, so men were superior to women. So that association between women and nature, and the assumption that because we're human, we can dominate nature, it's there for our use, also happened to women. There are whole feminist philosophers who've written books about this. So I think it's very much necessary in order for us to heal our relationship with the planet as a species, to also heal our relationship with the feminine.
And that came also from the creation story of the Judaic Abrahamic traditions, right? Of saying, reinterpreting it. I would argue that it was a misinterpretation of Garden of Eden story, but that it became an instruction to dominate and control, which then was...
Yeah, it's interesting that those stories are very much a function of patriarchal monotheistic religion. So it's curious. One of the saddest things I ever read, and an author I admired deeply, Robin Wall Kimmerer, her beautiful book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And it was just at the time, I think, when I was writing If Women Rose Rooted, that I read that. And she was telling her the creation stories of her native peoples. And she said, and the creation story of the West is the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. And no, it's not. It's not our creation story. Not in my country, it's not. My creation story is an old woman with straggly hair who drops stones from her aprons and creates the land. And it's really kind of interesting that that is a story from another place entirely, and a much later story that was superimposed over that. So, you know,
She
we
has
have
Sky
to go
Falling
back.
Woman who comes down with her hands full of seeds, and yeah, it's a beautiful story. And,
but it's the same, you see. You know, our traditions are similar in that sense. We have the same creation stories. It's just that we've forgotten that that's what they were.
But I just want to add too that I think it's really interesting that you mentioned in Ireland the lack of a central creation story, and is that because pre-Christian times it was tribal, and so each place had its own? There wasn't a dominant singular god?
No, it's almost certain that there would have been. So, you know, the Celts came from in Indo-Europe, and in fact the Indo-Europeans effectively populated most of Europe in one form or another. And we know from Indo-European mythology that there were creation stories in the various other parts. So there would have been one. It is just, I think it's seriously a function of the fact that this stuff was written down by Christian monks. So they were quite happy to write down the old stories. They were quite happy to write down the sagas, which the bards, the fili, the poets told them. There was no way in the world that they were going to write down the teachings of the Druids. And so a lot of what we would like to know about, you know, our ancestors' religion, we can't go to any texts, we can't go to any teachings, we have to infer it from the worldview that is prevalent in the old stories that were written down because they thought they were a little bit more
And
harmless.
we have the same with the codexes and the Jesuits translating the same stories. And
Right.
there's bits and pieces that we can bring back. Any other questions here?
I so appreciated the comments you made about the land wants us to be in a relationship regardless of where our ancestors come from. And in this country, many of us are suffering like the ache of the fact that this isn't our native land. I read from Rosarita like voraciously and know that you were on quite your journey to find your connection to the place that you do have your roots in. So what might you say about that theme for those of us who, like, I'm Eastern European Jew descendant, and like, where am I supposed to go, for example? Like, so what, I don't know, just if you have anything to offer on that subject of like relationship to place and to the ancestry and the belonging, those themes that are so alive for so many of us.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is going to be a big subject tomorrow, but in brief, I think it's a question. If you have some sense of ancestral, of some sense of lineage, some sense of continuity, wherever it comes from, then to me the work that is good to do is to take that and bring it back to the place where your feet are planted. So there's like these two threads. There's your ancestral thread, your ancestral stories, which of course are based in completely different parts of the world. You cannot find a Cailleach here. You cannot. She is absolutely and wholly immanent in the land of Ireland. She only makes sense there. She is the land of Ireland. You're not going to find her in the New Mexico desert, but you're going to find an old woman. And if knowing the stories, your ancestral stories, let's say you were Irish rather than Eastern European, which I don't know very much about, if your ancestral stories back in Ireland told you about a Cailleach, then that is in some way already in you, that archetype. You can find that archetype, you understand that archetype. And then what you have to do is actually easier than it sounds. I'll talk about that tomorrow for those of you who are in there. You find it in your own place. So your ancestral tradition is informing your relationship with the land where your feet are actually planted. And then the two come together. And that's really, really important to bring those together, because I know too many people who are looking for their ancestral stories and finding a longing for those ancestral stories that prevent them from being rooted in the place where their feet are planted. And you owe it to the land that is giving you life. You have to build that relationship. So if the one can inform the other, it's like an imaginal link, it's another bridge, then I think it can help you find those new stories that you need to be in this place.
And I think one of the things you say a lot is that the questions are more important than the answers. So wouldn't it be more important to keep asking that question? That's sort of what I was implying about the times we're in. You know, we're here and we're aware of this now. We might not have been as aware of it before. You know, we might have come from people who felt the right to come and take over a place or to exploit people or a place. And now we're going, no, that's not really who we really want to be. so we're going to retell that story, but it's important to keep asking what that means. I think maybe it's easier for me because I don't have the rootedness that you have in your place. So I'm enjoying actually the mystery and the uncertainty that comes with asking that question.
Sure, and I think everybody has their own way in. I mean, some people don't have a very strong sense of any, particular ancestral lineage, or some people have a lot. And then to me, it's, well, which one do you relate to more? There's no right way of doing this. I don't think it's just a question of whatever captures your imagination, whatever allows that bridge to be made, so that you feel a sense of belonging to the place where you're actually planted. And I believe very firmly that myth and story can do that, and it doesn't have to be ready-made. We are myth makers. We always were myth makers, and we didn't stop being myth makers 2,000 years ago when somebody wrote the Bible or other books or whatever it might have been. We are still myth makers. That's what we do. It's just that we're not really encouraged to do that anymore, and that's really, to me, the most important function that I think we can play in a particular place.
And I'm so grateful that you're bringing the woman's voice back to that work that we're doing.
For sure. I mean, to me, it's for everybody to do. It's very much for men to do as well. Exactly the same work in different ways, and what they bring to it, and that sense of balance. And again, don't forget that sense of balance being so critical in all of these mythologies. That you need both types of energy. You need both ways of relating. The men in these old stories related to the land. Everybody thinks that Irish mythology, particularly, if they don't know it very well, is a bunch of hero stories. You have Finn McCool, you have Cuchulainn, but those warriors, if you look at the context, if you actually read the old texts rather than someone's misinterpretation of it, they are in service to the land. They're fighting, their battles are all in service to the land, very, very clearly. So it's not just about women connecting. Women in the old literature might have connected in slightly different ways, but the same job, if you like.
And didn't he get his knowledge from a salmon?
He did. No, that's Finn McCool.
We're in a salmon country here, so I thought I'd bring that
salmon
up.
of wisdom. Absolutely.
Anyone else? Steve, do you see some? Oh, okay. Go ahead.
This is totally off topic, but wondering if you had any thoughts or opinions about popular entertainment, specifically like Game of Thrones, and how they take mythology. And just wondering if there's work that you know of being done with people who are creating popular games or popular entertainment to talk about the authenticity of storytelling.
You see, again, I think it's part of this business of...
Repeat the quote we didn't hear.
It was about the authenticity of things like Game of Thrones and kind of like, modern kind of like, I don't know, really reinterpretations are they, but to me that is actually very fine in lots of ways. I mean, depending obviously on the particular nature of the story, because it's not passing itself off as anything that it isn't. It's just, again, it's using archetypal characters, it's using archetypal situations and archetypal landscapes in order to capture people's imagination, to help them see particular things. So I don't think that every story in the world has to have some authentic root. It's just that it is very easy to get irritated when you come from a country where those are living traditions and people disrespect them by not feeling any obligation to get it right. It's true for us as much as it is for people in other places. The Finn stories, for example, the stories about Finn McCool, the Salmon of Wisdom, all of that kind of thing, in the Gaelic, which is the Irish language-speaking area where I live, these stories are still told. They're not just in old text, they're told around fires, they're told in the pubs. Everybody knows Finn stories. So they're living traditions, and it's very important to me not to disrespect them. But anybody who takes those ideas and works with them, there's a Finn McCool in every culture. So that's fine. I know that's answered your question.
I would add, though, that I think a lot of Indigenous people are feeling that they should be the right ones to say what is said about themselves. And so again, we're going back to, to me, it's about respecting sovereignty. It's or rebalancing it. It's like we just took whatever we wanted and made up what we wanted. Hollywood would have, we have the sports logos and we have this issue going on. And for me, it's about going back to this Dame Ragnall story. Who gets to decide? And I think for my generation, I want to say, you do it your way. A lot of my work, I don't tell them what they should do. It's about, what do you want? How can I help you do that? And I think that's a shift, and we need to keep making that shift. So it's another point of view about who gets to tell their own story too. There was another hand back. Yes.
Can you say something about Brigid? Is she gonna hold, or is she just,
She's probably the most complicated character. Basically, in the old texts, the goddess Brigid, there was a goddess Brigid, receives very, very little mention. We know, for example, that there were 3 Brigids, 3 sisters, all the same age, by the way, just as another thing. The maiden mother crone thing does not exist in Celtic mythology. Robert Graves made that up in his White Goddess book. It doesn't exist, okay? So they're always the same age, but of the 3 triple deities are quite common in the Irish mythology. So we know that there were 3 Brigids. We know that she was a smith, a poetess, patron of the arts, basically. We know that she was a daughter of the Dagda, who was kind of like the father of the gods, who sounds very important, but actually doesn't appear very much in many of the stories. Very little mention of her. It's, just another couple of brief mentions of her. One is inventing keening, kind of like the wailing songs that are sung over death. That's it. That's as much as we know about Brigid in the old texts. Now, we know that there are various things that are named after Brigid. We have archaeology evidence to bring on top of the old texts, and we know that there were various wells that were named after Brigid. So Brigid seems to have been honoured around Ireland. Folklore is the third strand, so you've got the old written text, you've got archaeology, folklore. There are lots of stories about Brigid which also go into the popular tradition. However, it is very clear, I have studied this a lot, so this is quite definitive, not everybody would agree with me, but I think it's true, that she was co-opted by the Christian Church, because we see this happening constantly, very, very regularly. She was probably a fairly powerful figure, particularly in Kildare. She was then transformed into St. Brigid of Kildare. There may have been a real Brigid who was the abbess of Kildare. We don't know, actually. But just because lives were written about her doesn't mean to say that they were true. So basically a lot of the characteristics of probably what would have been the old goddess Brigid were then attributed to St. Brigid of Kildare. And you can very, very clearly see in the stories that were written about St. Brigid of Kildare, a lot of very, very old pagan motifs. So, there are ideas that she was brought up by druids, that she was given the milk of an otherworldly cow when she was a baby. So you can almost see, that shifting from one tradition to the other. But almost everything that you hear about Brigid today is actually based on the stories of the Christian saint, not the old goddess, because there just isn't very much. But that doesn't necessarily matter, as long as you know that.
Can we know the origin of Maiden Mother Crone again? What's the name of the man?
Robert Graves perpetrated a lot of very wicked things. He made many things up. He wrote a book called The White Goddess, which a lot of people read and think that it was, proper Celtic mythology. It's not. I don't know what he was doing. He didn't seem to have any obligation to get that right. And he was a very fine writer, but he made up, there was something else, a tree calendar, the Celtic tree calendar. Absolute fabrication. Absolute fabrication. And everybody's out there selling cards and oracles on it now. Sorry, Robert Graves.
That's why we need you, Sharon.
More than me, but
Yes.
I have a lot of friends that are LGBTQ, and of course, they have a lot of gender spectrum now, so I'm just wondering how this fits in with the spectrum.
yeah, to me, none of these are about sexual orientation. It is about gender, and it's about particular energies. So, in the same way that Taoism and the I Ching might talk about masculine and feminine energies and the need for them to be both in balance, this is what these stories are effectively doing. On the other hand, there are biological things called women who can be raped, and against whom many things have been perpetrated, and so those old stories are about women in that context. So I don't really see them as exclusive, and sexual orientation, particularly in the stories, is often, it can be fluid too. I think it's predominantly about masculine and feminine energies in the world, and what that might represent.
So it's just how to bring them into
Yeah.
focus on the energy.
You can do, yes, but of course, they are also nevertheless about biological men and women, if I can put it that way, at that different, very basic level.
Yes.
What about Shiva Nikki? I'm not sure if I said that right.
Yeah, that's an archaeological thing that you find. Does anybody know what that is? The Sheela-na-gig? Okay, so these are stone carvings that are found on, curiously, mostly on old churches, effectively of an old woman. Well, it's not always an old woman, but many of them are of old women, basically with gaping vulvas. So they've got their legs apart, and it's more vulva than anything else, frankly. And everybody's very curious about what these were doing on old churches. Somebody had a very fine sense of humour in those days, but it was Ireland, so that's probably true. So there's no reference to those in the old texts, but there are a whole lot of theories about this relating to the hag. There are some theories that it relates to herons and the hag. There's a whole bunch of theories about where it might have come from, but undoubtedly, I say undoubtedly, again, there are some scholars that would disagree, but most people would imagine that this is just some ancient fertility symbol that somehow or other got passed into churches in the days when pagan and Christian ideas weren't quite so much in conflict. In the Irish literature, for example, it's very clear that the Christian monks tried to insert Christian ideas into some of the old stories. You can actually see the very clear Christian threads. But there are also lots of stories of St. Patrick, for example, who is not one of my favourite characters. Well, but this is a good one. This is a good one. Where the stories, and Colmcille, or Columba as he's often called, where the stories which were written down by Christian monks have St. Patrick, or Colmcille, happening across an otherworldly character, usually a young male, with whom they have conversations, and the otherworldly character in these stories will say to St. Patrick or St. Columba, will you tell me something of your Christian wisdom? Now you would think that immediately the priests would, write all of this stuff down. No, they have St. Patrick and St. Columba asking instead for the otherworldly male to pass on his knowledge and understanding. And even one story where St. Patrick basically turns to his scribes and says, you must write this down, it is important knowledge, for everybody, it must be preserved. So there was a time where, a very short time unfortunately, where there wasn't that conflict, and where it was respected and not seen necessarily as in opposition until a little bit later on, particularly after the Reformation. So it's entirely possible that these Sheela-na-gigs would have just been would have been all right.
How come the Roman Christians predominated in Ireland? What happened?
It's a very long story, a quite complicated story, but that really didn't happen in Ireland until the Reformation, when basically the Roman, which would have been, 12th, 13th century.
Because the Celtic Christian church was very different.
It's not always as different as people think, and there's a whole controversy about whether there was actually any such thing. It's very clear that there was such a thing. They had different ways of being. Again, it's a long story, but it was predominantly, a lot of it was about sponsorship. Back in the day, the old tribes, the clans would support their local monastery, and often the abbots and the abbesses came from the local family, the local chieftain family, and then they would give lots of money to it and patronage. And as the family system began to die out, when the Normans invaded Ireland and what have you, so the funding often died out as well, and they were looking for different different power structures, different ways of funding. So it's all very complicated, but it was quite late in the day.
Okay. I can't see the hands. Stefan, yeah.
I've heard Martin Shaw talk a lot about the business of housekeeping and manners in relationship to story. I was wondering if you could say anything about that, for example, with Cailleach, rather than how she might feed us, what we might do, or how one might proceed in such a way where she might even bother showing up for a minute.
Yeah, and to me, it is absolutely the case that stories spring from the land, that these stories have an independent existence, and so absolutely, you have to be in relationship with a story like you have to be in a relationship with a person. Which is why I feel so strongly that there is an obligation to get it right and not take it out of context unreasonably. And all of my own personal relationship with the Cailleach and my attachment to stories about the Cailleach very much came from my relationship with a place where Cailleach mythology was everywhere. There were mountains named after her, there were silhouettes of her in the hills and what have you. And it comes back again, I think, to that concept of apprenticeship to story. You sit with it for a while, you live it, you breathe the land, and it's one of the reasons why I have a little bit of reluctance, to work with stories from other cultures where I have not been in the place, where I haven't been in the land, because it just again seems disrespectful, like I'm taking something that I haven't earned. And I think if we are in relationship with the land, and we respect the land, and we love the land, then that's when we begin to have that sense of story. I find it very interesting, though, another aspect of your question, another aspect of an answer to your question, that certain archetypes are coming up again and again and again around the world. Certain archetypes are growing. There is such an interest in old woman stories. There's such an interest in the Kaya. Where has that come from? And again, it's that whole concept of the mundus imaginalis. These characters, these archetypes are alive. There is a sense of receptivity, I think, a sense that we're open to certain types of energy, to certain types of characters, certain types of stories. And I think by telling the stories, we are serving the purpose, whatever it may be, of those characters, of those archetypes, of the anima mundi itself, maybe. So to me, that's what it's about. That's where the respect comes from. But it's all about listening, getting it right, not blundering in, not thinking you know the story better than anybody else, but just, treating it with a bit of respect.
One more question. Who would like to end on what note? What did you hear that you loved tonight?
I think we've
Is
exhausted.
there a man that, there is a man that would like to ask a question. Some of you know him as my husband.
I really like what you said about the need to maintain myths, but also kind of upgrade them or bring them into current reality. How do you avoid having the myths then misinterpreted for any one in particular purpose? So they aren't going to take a myth and make it into their own little stories or justification for how they want to be. How do you avoid that?
Yeah, and again, I think you can't avoid. People are always going to do that, aren't they? But I think for those of us who really want to work with story in a meaningful and authentic way, it's very much about looking for new aspects of these archetypal characters or situations. So, there are lots and lots of stories about the Gaelic, for example, in the Irish tradition, but some of them are quite recent. It's not that they were all written down or 1,500 years ago. Some of them they're constantly being reinvented, these stories about the Gaelic, but you know that it's the Gaelic, because they're true to the archetype. And the archetype is a guardian and protector of the earth. It's guardian and protector of wild places. It's like, the forbidder of anybody raping women, the land, and what have you. So I think once you understand the archetype, if I can put it that way, once you understand the essence of a character or the essence of a story, then you can work with it. And it's eminently movable, changeable. Stories want to transform just like we do. They want to grow. I believe that too. The archetypes want to grow. But it's keeping true to the essence of it, and then I think you're on a good track. Does that answer it?
Yeah, the Gaelic is about transformation.
For sure, yeah. And all of these stories are in lots, at their essence, whoever the archetype is, whether it's a male or a female.
Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you.